Before we get started on the Hebrews class, I want to comment on Owen got that time card completed, and we all applauded for him. For those who haven't been through the Bible Lab material, it's a challenging course of study. Those young people who've come through there, I mean, Zaylee's in there and Wendy's in there, and they start about that age group and they go all the way. They've got curriculum that takes through a high school level, and I don't mean like an easy high school level. I mean, like they're doing research papers and they're writing essays and stuff. If they complete the full curriculum, it is an intensive study for true Bible students. And the people who come through there have a foundation in the scriptures that is impressive, that I wish I would have had at that age. Not that I would have appreciated it at that age, but I wish I would have had it. So what Owen's doing, what all these young people are doing it's really a big accomplishment. It really is. And that's why it's worthy of celebration. That's why it's worthy of applause. All right, Hebrews. No worries. Hebrews, we're in chapter 10, beginning in verse 19. We're going to cover just this paragraph today, and if we finish early, then we finish early. Hopefully we won't be too long, but there's a lot of stuff in just this paragraph. So we'll read it and then we'll go back and break it apart. Hebrews chapter 10, verse 19. Therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way, which he consecrated for us through the veil, that is, his flesh, and having a high priest over the house of God, let us draw near with the true heart in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. So, we focus on the transition words, right? The word therefore that we see in the beginning of verse 19. Therefore, because of what we looked at previously. What did we look at previously that this therefore is building on? This new law, that is one of the things that we looked at a little bit before, but there's a point that's made more recently at the beginning of chapter 10. It's this better sacrifice that we have. So if we go back just a few verses, look at chapter 10, verse 12. But this man, Jesus, the Messiah, the Christ, the Son, after he had offered one sacrifice for sins forever, sat down at the right hand of God. That's that sacrifice we're looking at. And again in verse 14, for by one offering he has perfected forever those who are being sanctified. And then in verse 18, now where there is remission of these sins, there is no longer an offering for sin. So we're talking about this sacrifice that the Son made for us forever, that there's remission of sins, there's no more offerings needed. Therefore, because of that sacrifice, then we get to see the results of that sacrifice. So therefore, brethren, having boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus. What's boldness? You okay? So what's this boldness that we're looking at? Rich? Confidence? I heard confidence over here too, right? So what causes that confidence? Is it because of me? No. Not because of Ben. That's certainly true, even as cocky and arrogant as I can be. What does our confidence come from? What gives us this boldness? Jen?
I think it's related to absolute trust in God.
Okay. Specifically in what? Yes. Right. So we have confidence, and we'll look at that in another verse or two. We have confidence, complete trust. What's another word for trust? Faith. That sacrifice really does what he says that sacrifice does. If we really buy that, if we really trust that, if we really believe that, then should we have boldness to approach? Yeah. Again, not because of who we are, not because of anything that we've done, but because we believe what we've been told about the sacrifice that Jesus made for us. That gives us that boldness. Roberta.
You know, so amazing to me, and I was so glad that you took the time to really describe the tabernacle and the way the temple was set up, because you get the sense of the Holy of Holies was just so, it was almost a scary place to be. It was so sacrosanct, literally sacrosanct, that, and I even heard this mentioned, I don't know if it's true or not, but when the high priest would go in once a year, they had to put a tether around his legs, just in case something happened, because nobody could go in there and get him. If they had to have a way to pull him back out. And I don't know if that's true or not, I've just heard that.
I've heard the same thing. If he has a heart attack and dies in there, they got to be able
They
to
just
reel him
have
in.
a way to help and get him back out, because you can't go in and get him. And it's amazing to me that in light of that, right now, any one of us here, with all our foibles, can walk into that place now, to be renewed, our relationship with God again, like in the garden. We're back into that kind of position. And that's amazing.
Right.
When you really contemplate it.
That we've been made that pure, like Roberta said, like we were in the garden, where we see Adam walking and talking with God. We've got that relationship back because of this sacrifice. Now, is it easy for us to buy that?
It should be, but it's not.
So is it easy for us to kind of lose that confidence, doubt it a little bit because we know what we've done?
Why me?
And what's more powerful than the sins that we've committed? The sacrifice that was made for us, and we've got to recall that. Good. So like Roberta was saying, just like the tabernacle, the priest goes in there. We've got boldness to enter the holiest by the blood of Jesus. Does someone have a different word than holiest or most holy place in verse 19? Okay. Some translations have holy places, and that's really what it is. That could anyone just go into the first holy place in the tabernacle?
No.
No. Could anyone go into the most holy place even further in? No. How did, and I think this means the holiest, well, it really means both, because the word means plural, holy places. But you had to be the right type of person to get into the first one, and to get into the second one. How did the high priest ever get into the second of those rooms, the most holy place?
Had to be from a specific family and a specific tribe.
Okay, but did that mean he just go in whenever he wanted?
Had to be ordained by God, essentially.
Okay,
Once a year.
once a year, and what did he have to bring with him every single time? Blood. Then that's what we see here in the end of verse 19. So we have boldness to go into that place with the blood of Jesus, or by the blood of Jesus. So the high priest couldn't go in, even on the Day of Atonement. He had to bring blood with him every single time. Every single time. That's what got him in. For us, it's the same. That sacrifice that was made once, that sacrifice that was made forever, that sacrifice that covered us completely, that's how we have that boldness to go into the holiest. And what's the true holiest? Not the room in the tabernacle, but what's the true holiest?
Presence of God.
The presence of God. In heaven, in the throne room of God, where he's sitting on his throne and Christ is sitting next to him. We have confidence, boldness, almost like the expectation that we can go there and be there. Yes.
Wouldn't it be the opposite though? Like, I wouldn't want to, I want to be next to God, don't get me wrong, but it's so intimidating of who he is. Like, how can I be bold? No, you know what I mean? Like, going into those rooms, that's like kind of freaky. I don't want to like do anything or mess anything up, or, you know, I would be the same mentality with God too.
Okay. Let's talk about that. How should we treat that? How should we approach it? Now, think about who God is and the power that he wields, and just his nature. Is that intimidating to us? If it's not, you really need to examine a little bit more. Think about the rulers that we have in this world. Think about the President of the United States. And I don't care which president you think about. Just think about a president that you like throughout history of the United States. Can we just approach and kind of bop into the residential section of the White House and hang out with him?
No,
No, why not?
because we're not allowed to.
Okay, why not?
Because they don't know if I'm gonna kill him.
Yeah, true. True. Can we have boldness to approach the President of the United States and tell him our thoughts and concerns and whatever? No, not really. Now, our current president has a young son living in the White House, Barron Trump. Previous president had 2 daughters living with him in the White House. The president before that had 2 daughters living with him in the White House. Could they approach the president in a completely different way than we could ever approach the president? Why? Because of their relationship with the president, because of that tie. Now remember, we've had those ties with God before. Roberta talked about Adam in the garden. What caused us to lose those ties? Our sin. Now, this sacrifice, does it fix that? So then do we have that relationship again? That tie again? Yeah. So we can, I mean, despite the nature of who he is, we have that relationship with him like we did before, like Adam did before, because of the relationship that was mended because of the sacrifice that was made.
A description of that was Rebecca's grandma, Mabel, right?
Mhm.
I remember we were at her house 10 years ago or so, and she was talking about, I can't remember if she was talking about Jesus or if she was talking about God. But she was sitting on the couch, and she just goes, it's just like he's sitting right here with me. He's always right beside me. That's the kind of relationship that Mabel Wright had.
Yeah.
Just and she called him a friend. And it showed in her life. She wasn't, you believed her when she
Right.
said that.
Right. So does that help with how we can approach this in spite of who he really is? Okay, so we have that boldness, that confidence to go before him into his presence. Now we get there by, in verse 20, a new and living way, which he consecrated for us through the veil that is his flesh. What's this new and living way? Yeah, I'm sorry?
His way.
His way. Did he set this up for us? Yeah? Did we read about it in the book of Hebrews?
I'm sure we did.
That's a safe answer. In chapter 8, we talk about that new covenant, that new arrangement that God put in place with this group of people, right? With us. Is that how we get to God? Through that new covenant? Yeah. So this way that we're talking about, this living way, is new and improved. It's this better covenant that he put in that we talked about in verse 8. So we've got that covenant. That enables us to approach the holiest, the holy place, the presence of God with boldness, which he consecrated for us. Consecrated sounds like ordained, right? Doesn't it sound like this big fancy word? Who has a different word than consecrated in verse 20? Opened.
Yeah.
Opened or inaugurated or he kind of created. Remember, we keep going back to the role of Jesus as author of our faith or as captain of our faith, and that he's the trailblazer. We looked at this in the earlier chapters. That's what he did. That's what this ordained or open or inaugurated word means, or consecrated. This new and living way that he blazed the trail for us, and that goes through the veil in verse 20. What's the veil that we see in verse 20? His flesh.
Holy of Holies now.
Yeah, the Holy of Holies. Like Roberta was talking about, when we looked at the layout of the tabernacle, and you had the first veil, which got us into the first holy place, and then you have that second veil, which got us into the most holy place, and that way was paved for us by Jesus' flesh. Now, in Matthew chapter 27 and verse 51, remember, the second that Jesus dies, what happens to the veil leading to the most holy place in the temple? It's torn. How is it torn? Kind of a unique way. From top to bottom. Now that represents that this way to God is no longer blocked. It's no longer separated. It's no longer preventing people from getting in there. Jesus, when his flesh was sacrificed, opened up the way through the veil to the presence of God. And I think that's what we're looking at here in verse 20. That this way that he opened for us through the veil that separated us by his flesh. And that his flesh was that sacrifice that we're looking at, this better sacrifice that removed that separation between us and the presence of God. Are we okay with that? Okay. There's a lot of Old Testament stuff, and there's a lot of arguments that we've built on since the beginning of the book. So I want to make sure that we're okay here. And having a high priest over the house of God in verse 21. Some say high priest, some translations say a great priest. Remember, the book leading up to now, we've been talking about the nature of Jesus and then the nature of his job. The first 4 chapters talk about him as a son of the Father, a son of God, better than prophets, better than angels, better than Moses and all these other guys who got the law. We've talked about him being that better high priest. Remember, we've got 7 qualities that we've been looking at as him and his role in high priest. That he's a high priest of a better covenant than these Old Testament style priests. He's a high priest with an oath that the rest of it just mattered who your dad was. God said, you're a high priest and you're my priest forever. He's this great priest because he's a sinless priest. He's a great priest because he's an unchangeable priest. He's an undying priest. He's an eternal priest. And then we talked about he's a priest with a better covenant in chapter 8. He's a priest that serves in a better tabernacle in chapter 9. And is a priest that offers better sacrifices in chapter 10. All these things make him this great priest over the house of God in verse 21. In verse 22, let us draw near with a true heart and full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. This verse right here is why some people think that Paul wrote the letter, because it's so dense. There's so much stuff here. Let us draw near. How do we draw near?
We cuddle.
I'm sorry?
We cuddle.
We cuddle? Can we cuddle with the Father?
Why not?
If we have that relationship with him, think of it how you will, not being disrespectful to anyone or anything about that relationship with him, but if he is that Father to us, and we have had that relationship been made right through that sacrifice, can we approach him as a child would approach the Father? Calling out, Abba, Father? Yeah.
Well, actually, Rossi's not too far from it, because the Old Testament Psalms will talk about being brought into the pinions of his wings, and that's when, like eagle would spread out their wings and bring their chicks in underneath their armpit area.
Right.
That's, well, I guess you call that cuddling.
What was John's posture at what we consider the Last Supper?
He was leaning on his breast.
He was leaning on his shoulder, or laying across Jesus somehow. Go back in Hebrews to chapter 2, verse 1. There's one of the first warnings that we have there as far as what these guys are risking. In chapter 2, verse 1, therefore we must give more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away. So I think what we're looking at in 10:22 is the opposite of what we see in 2:1, as far as they're not paying attention and they're slowly drifting away. They're not giving the effort, they're not giving the focus, and they're at risk of losing what they've got. Conversely, let us draw near. Put in that effort, put in that focus on that relationship. Let us draw near to God with a true heart. What's true? Sincere. So we're not biased. We don't have ulterior motives in what we're doing. Look at the question that, like we looked at in Roger's lesson this morning, the question that the lawyer asked Jesus about who is my neighbor. Was that person, based on the evidence that we have, trying to draw near with a sincere heart? No, he had other motives. Is that a risk for us? Yeah, always. So this true, it's sincere, it's not mixed, it's pure, it's real, it's genuine, it's committed. The thought is unalloyed. What's an alloy?
A mixture of metals.
It's a mixture of metals. So steel. Steel is an alloy of what? Iron and carbon. So is it pure iron?
No.
Is it pure carbon? No. White gold. Those of us who have not yellow gold, but white gold rings. What's white gold? It's an alloy of gold and silver. Is it pure gold? What if you need pure gold? Can you get it out of it? What if you need pure silver? But in that mixture, it's alloyed. It's not pure. So when we say, when we're drawing near with a pure heart or a true heart or a sincere heart, there's nothing muddying that. There's nothing clouding that. There's nothing impure in that. So we're drawing near with the true heart in full assurance of the faith. What's this full assurance?
So going back up to verse 19, is that confidence and that trust?
Yeah. It's that same confidence, it's that same conviction, it's that same thought of boldness. We've got in our heart, we're pure in our heart, we're true in our heart, we're fully committed and full assurance of what? Faith. What's another word for faith? Trust. We're fully trusting in what we've been told. And fully trusting in what we have. Does this sound like there's a lot of big commitment going on just in this little sentence right here? It's not a little sentence, but just in this sentence right here? Yeah. This is a big thing that's just thrown out here. Yes?
Do you think that's why, like, people, like, deviate away from God because they just don't, like, reading things like that is just intimidating and they don't want to change? You know what I mean? You know what I'm asking? I'm probably not even wording it.
So it's a willful choice not to participate in what God's given us because it's just
Yeah,
kind of hard?
Almost like guys that are, like, I'm stereotyping, I probably shouldn't stereotype, like, college age, like, they don't want a serious relationship, they just want to go girl. Well, that's how they don't want to commit to anything.
Okay. Remember that next week when we get into verse 26.
Come on.
Because that's what we're talking about. Because remember who's receiving this letter. It's people that are facing persecution and they're saying, this is hard, this other thing is easier, and whether by conscious choice or just by lack of attention to their faith and lack of focus and lack of commitment, they're moving away from this relationship with God through Christ. They're going back to the old law. They're going back to what's easiest, either by conscious choice or by lack of focus, which they're choosing to move away from the harder yet better thing. That's what this whole book is written for, and the warnings are there throughout the whole letter. Okay, the full assurance of faith, that full confidence we have in our trust, having our hearts sprinkled from an evil conscience and our bodies washed with pure water. So there's two parallels here in the second half of this verse. The first one is having our hearts, whatever happens to our hearts. What's the heart? Is it the emotion center? Mark's giving me not an answer. Remember when...
What do you mean? Like in a physical sense or like spiritual sense or like...
Figurative sense.
That still doesn't tell me.
It doesn't really. When we see hearts in New Testament writings, what's the author? What would we in our modern English say instead of heart?
Mind or intention.
We'd say our mind. So this is the thinking area of our body. So when we're saying let our hearts be resolved from an evil conscience. We're saying let our minds. Now, is that easy?
No,
Why?
because we're human and we're dumb.
We're human and we're dumb, but we like to hang on to guilt too, don't we? Is it hard for, think of, this is not an upbuilding exercise, but think about the things that we've done in our life that have separated from us from God. Is it hard for us to get over those things? And yet God says our minds need to be purified of that evil conscience. The things that we've done, the things that have separated us from God, and since their sin, they're deserving of death. Our minds need to be purified of that because we've been purified of that. Our souls have been purified of that. So if we're hanging on to this and God says, I've made that right, do we have that full assurance of trust? Do we have that boldness, that confidence, that belief in what He's told us that Christ's sacrifice achieves? That's hard. That takes trust. Because we tend to, I don't think this is our intent, but when we do that, we maximize our sin to the point that we limit Christ's sacrifice, that Christ's sacrifice can't cover this. And we tend to do it more with ourselves, I think, than with others. Yeah, I think that Christ's sins cover you, but Christ's sacrifice covers you, but Christ's sacrifice doesn't cover me, because my stuff's too big. That we may not say that out loud, but I think we do that in our head. But this is saying these minds, our hearts, our minds, the thinking center of us is purified by this sacrifice. Now, opposite of minds, we'll come back to the purification piece in verse 22 in a second. Opposite of minds, we have bodies. Our bodies are washed with pure water, right? So we've got our mind, we've got our body. Our minds have been purified by the sprinkling, and our bodies have been purified by washing. What's left? There's not. The mind includes the soul, remember, because it's the thinking part. So, there's nothing left. All of us, figuratively speaking, obviously, all of us has been purified by this sacrifice. And I say figuratively because, let's go back and look at how it's done. Our hearts are sprinkled. What's sprinkling? So she's making a flicking motion with her hand. Remember, the people, the Old Testament Israelites, when that covenant came at Mount Sinai, how were the people purified at the giving of that covenant? I got ladies over on this side making flicking gestures. Yeah, because they killed a bunch of animals and they mixed red wool in with the blood of those animals, and they took a hyssop sprig and they dipped it in the wool and they flung it out on the people. That was sprinkling. That was purifying the people by putting dirty blood on them, right? According to the law, that's how it worked. Remember, the high priest couldn't go into the holiest place without taking blood of a ram and flinging it in there on these beautiful golden pieces of furniture, and then going back and taking the blood of a goat and flinging it on these beautiful... Can you imagine what the Ark of the Covenant looked like after several years of worship? This is crusty brown blood covering this beautiful golden thing. I think when the Babylonians went in there and they conquered it and they pulled this thing out, it's like, what did they do to this? This is nasty. But that's what purified. That's the sprinkling that purified under the Old Covenant. So our hearts have been figuratively sprinkled, literally cleansed by this sacrifice. Now, the bodies have been washed with pure water. What's this? I heard something. Baptism. I hear with shrugged shoulders and raised eyebrows. We jump to baptism. And I don't have a problem with that, because this is written to Christians. We're Christians. We know that baptism cleanses us because it helps us participate in the sacrifice that Jesus made. Consider this, though. We're talking about Jewish Christians who were raised being taught the old law. There are all kinds of purifications under the old law. If you look at Leviticus chapter 15, and remember in context, Leviticus chapter 16 is what the high priest has to do to cleanse himself, to cleanse the people, the Day of Atonement, all those sacrifices that we've looked at repeatedly. Leviticus chapter 15 is purification for folks who have discharge, is what the New King James calls it. Anything on the inside of your body that made its way to the outside of the body. Remember, Roger talked about why the Levite and the priest might not touch the Samaritan or the traveler in the parable of the Good Samaritan this morning, because if they touch blood, they're considered unclean. They had to go through a purification process, and a lot of those purification processes involved running water, clean water. So Leviticus chapter 15 is talking about purification from discharges. If you have a discharge, go separate yourself from the camp until it stops, and then wash your clothes in clean water, wash yourselves in clean water, and then after sundown you'll be clean. But if you sit on something and someone touches that something that you sit on, a saddle or a chair or whatever, you got to wash that with water. Whoever touched it has to go wash their clothes, wash themselves, and then after sundown they're clean again. And it just goes on and on and on. After birth, after menstruation, after all this stuff, you're unclean because something on the inside of you made it to the outside of you. Therefore, you got to wash your clothes in clean water. You got to wash yourself in clean water, and then after sundown, you'll be clean. There's all these washings for purification. So we've got symbolic purification, sanctification coming from sprinkling blood, and we've got other purification, sanctification coming from washing in water. And now this is all under the old law. So if you've got symbolic blood-based purification and physical water-based purification, and we see in verse 22 that we've got through this sacrifice and our confidence and trust in this sacrifice, we have our minds purified and our bodies purified. There's no part of us that hasn't been purified, and all the ways that things are purified under the old covenant, we've been purified under this new covenant. Roxy.
So I'm confused. So I remember reading Leviticus, and it was the most boring book in my life. But
Leviticus is fun.
oh my gosh, no. So like the whole cleansing thing,
Mm-hmm.
how women used to have their period,
Uh-huh.
they would did they send them away
Yes.
for a certain amount of days, and then after they're done, they wash themselves up and they come back.
Right.
Okay, so if that is dirty because it is inside of them excreting outside,
Yes.
how is blood sprinkled on golden statues? How is that purified?
Okay, good question. So let's look at the intent of the old law. Primarily, it was to teach them and prepare them for Jesus, this new relationship we have, right?
Yeah.
Is women washing, does that have anything to do with preparing us for Christ?
What?
No. Does blood-based sanctification and sacrifices making us right with God, does that prepare us for this relationship with Christ? It does. It does. So part of the, remember, I think there's multiple purposes. God's really efficient when he does stuff like this. There's multiple purposes under the old law. Primarily, it's to prepare the way for Jesus because that's most important. Prepare the way for Christ, prepare the way for this relationship we have with him. Were the Israelites under that old covenant supposed to be different than the people around them? Yes. Remember, part of the old covenant was you got to wear 4 tassels on your shirt. What's the purpose of that? I don't know. I think it was just to make them different. You're different than the people around you. Brittany.
A lot of the old laws also in the Old Testament was not only, I think, what you're saying, to set them aside, but sanitation practices were not common in the ancient world. Even a lot of the foods they ate, even today, can be potentially unclean, quote unquote,
Right.
just because of the nature of the animal, the way it's butchered, the way it's raised. So this was not only in a very physical sort of, we're setting you apart, but this is also sanitation practices that weren't being practiced, allowing them to prosper and flourish and multiply at a greater rate than their neighbors because they pretty much wallowed in their own filth.
Right. And I think that's what we're getting at there. Is that within the, I don't like using the phrase of ceremonial law versus whatever, because the Bible doesn't make that distinction. But we've got things that we can see in retrospect that are obviously pointing to Christ and are obviously pointing to God's people. And we see things that in retrospect are obviously pointing to the health of God's people, that they're not suffering these same diseases. Because when someone's oozing pus, they can't be part of the people. They got to be washed. They got to be cleaned before they can come back. And anybody who touches the pus has to go wash their clothes and wash their hands and wash their bodies. It sounds gross, but kind of how it's laid out, right? So it's a cleanliness thing. They can't eat rabbit. Why couldn't they eat rabbit?
It was hard to prepare and clean safely.
Because rabbit's kind of one of those dangerous things to eat, even now. What about pork? They couldn't eat pork because it's a dangerous thing. They couldn't eat bottom-feeding fish like shellfish and catfish and all these things, because if you don't prepare them properly, they can kill you. So that's all wrapped up in the law, I think, as part of, in addition to pointing to Christ, in addition to pointing to the church, hey, let's keep you alive in the meantime. So I think that's the efficiency of God when he gave you a law. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay, so we're talking about in verse 22, the inside of us and the outside of us, all of us, is cleaned both ceremonially and physically, figuratively, that all of us is cleaned in all the ways that we see under the old covenant, that this sacrifice really, 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 really makes us clean. Are we okay with that in verse 22? Okay. So, cleansing the inside of us, cleansing the outside of us, cleansing our minds, the sinking portion of our brain. I haven't even got through a full page of notes yet. Verse 23, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. Let us hold fast. When we see that word fast, think about the word fasten. We are latched on. Let us latch on to the confession of our hope. First of all, what's our hope? What's our ultimate hope? Going to heaven. Have we acted as much? Have we said as much that, yeah, we'd like to go to heaven? So let us hold fast to the confession of that hope. Now, what is a hope? Is it a wish? The way we use it, kind of, the word here that's being translated hope is an expectation. Do we have an expectation of heaven? Yeah, we should. Now, when we have a confession of our expectation of heaven, what's the confession?
A public statement, acknowledgement.
Okay, I like acknowledgement. The word means to speak the same as. So does God give us a hope of an expectation of heaven? Do we say that we want it? Yeah. If he says this is how you get there, do we say, okay, this is how I plan to get there? That's our confession. God says it and we speak the same thing. So when we're latched on to the agreement with what God said of our expectation of heaven, does it mean we're getting distracted and wandering off to these other things that are easier? No, we're fastened, we're latched on, we're staying true to what we said before, that God says, I want you to go to heaven and this is how you do it. And we say, okay, that's what I'm going to do. We're staying true to that. Back to chapter 2 that we looked at earlier, we're not drifting away. We're not inattentive. We're not being lazy in our faith. We are focused, we are locked on target with what God's asked us to do. Without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. There's two things in here. Or our confession, there's two things being said, right? There's our confession, our agreement with, our speaking the same as God's promise. We need to do what we said we're going to do because he is going to do what he said he's going to do. Our confession and his promise kind of go together. And if there's any foul up of the two, it's not his promise, It's our holding fast to that confession. Okay, verse 24. And let us consider one another in order to stir up love and good works. Consider quickly is just to fix our mind on something, kind of meditate is that same idea. So we're really thinking about one another to stir up love and good works, provoke to love and good works, stimulate to love and good works. Think about, we looked in Wednesday night recently about Christ appearing to Saul on the road to Damascus. And remember, the last thing that Jesus tells him is, why are you kicking against the goads? Meaning that Jesus is standing behind Paul with the sharp stick kind of pointing him. I want you to go this way. I want you to do this. It's the same idea of us stirring up each other, or us provoking love and good works among one another. It's goading, it's pushing, it's encouraging. It's kind of, let's go this way. Come on. That's what we need to do because of all these other things. That's part of us holding fast to our confession of our hope. Consider one another to stir up love and good works. This word love is the agape word for love. So it's not just this nice sentimental feeling. It's things that may be uncomfortable, but they're for the best. And then it's work. We're working. There's activity. Not just love and feeling good about people and whatever. There's activity that we're stirring each other up in. There's activity on my part on encouraging, and there's activity on your part on after being encouraged. Verse 25, sorry to rush, but I want us all to get to lunch sometime. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. Go to church, write what the verse says. What's the forsaking of the assembling that they're looking at here?
Not being there for their brothers and sisters.
Okay. How are we supposed to consider one another if we're not there with one another? Is this forsaking a temporary thing or a permanent thing?
It can turn into permanent.
Okay. Is he talking about them missing their Wednesday night Bible classes in this particular verse?
No, just the ones that make a habit of it.
Yeah. So if I'm forsaking, it's the idea of neglecting. So if I neglect, Audrey and I always ask each other, did you feed the dog this morning? Did you feed the dog tonight? Did someone feed the dog? Because there have been times, very rare, don't call PETA, that every once in a while we'll feed the dog late. Or, but he's fine. Have we neglected the dog? Is that animal neglect that we can go to jail for and be prosecuted under Idaho law for? No. But if we just decide, it's too difficult, we're not going to feed him anymore, we'll see what happens. That is neglect. That is forsaking. That is leaving behind. It's deserting it. It's abandoning it. That's what we're talking about here. And remember who's receiving this letter. These are Christians who are being persecuted heavily. Is it easier to persecute a group of people if they're all gathered together, or when you have to go house to house to get them? It's easier when they're all gathered together. I'm guessing some people said, for my own safety, maybe I'm not going to assemble with everybody. I'm still good with God, but maybe I'm not going to do that. Is that okay according to verse 25? No, because they've decided to abandon, he's not saying that they're thinking that they're abandoning God. They're abandoning the assembly. They're neglecting the assembly. I'm okay on my own. I can't stir up others. They can't stir me up, but I'm okay on my own. Now, I think it also includes those who are completely rejecting Christ and going back to whatever it is they had before. But that's what he's saying, is not forsaking, not neglecting, not completely denying the assembly, because we need to encourage one another, as is the manner of some, but encouraging one another, and so much the more as you see the day approaching. What's the day?
Judgment Day?
You said Judgment Day?
Yeah. Is it?
Well, I'm asking you.
Well, I'm asking
Well, let's ask everyone else. Is it Judgment Day?
Jesus' return.
Okay, so Judgment Day, Jesus' return. What else could it be?
Terminator.
Not Terminator. I heard something over here. All of the above?
Some kind of hard time and trial, time of trial.
Okay, so a time of trial. Some people say first day of the week that it could mean that. It's like, okay, on Monday I'm going to let you slide, but on Thursday I'm really going to get after you. Remember, who's receiving this letter? Hebrews. Where are they living? Jerusalem and around the area. Let's look quickly at Matthew chapter 24. Remember, Matthew 24 is where it starts. They go outside the temple and the disciples tell Jesus, hey, look at all the temple and all the buildings and stuff. And Jesus says, not one of these stones is going to be left on top of the other. It's going to be utterly wiped out. And then he talks the rest of the chapter, he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. And he gives them clues. He tells them what to expect. You know, people are going to say, here's the Messiah and there's a Messiah. No, don't believe any of that. It's ultimately going to accumulate when you see the abomination of desolation, or the abomination that makes desolate, standing right in the porch of the temple. And that goes back to Daniel. We're not going to talk about that today. But if you look in verse 9 of Matthew 24, this is still Jesus talking about what's going to happen before all this stuff is destroyed. They'll deliver you up to tribulation and kill you, and you'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake. Has this started happening to Christians in Jerusalem? Yeah. Let's look at verse 12. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Well, what's the whole point of the letter of Hebrews? Their love is starting to grow cold, and he's encouraging them to fix it. Verse 34. Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. Meaning, when Jesus says this in the early 30s, and we're in the mid-60s, are there still people around who were alive when Jesus was saying this that are receiving this letter from whoever wrote Hebrews? I think, I'm not going to be dogmatic about it, but the day of the Lord is always a day of judgment in the Old Testament, and we're talking to people who've been raised studying the Old Law and the Old Prophets. Specifically, Isaiah chapter 13 is talking about the destruction or the judgment on Babylon being a day of the Lord. In Zephaniah chapter 1, you've got destruction of Judah before Babylon comes in, being called a day of the Lord. Jeremiah 46, the destruction and judgment of Egypt being called a day of the Lord. In Ezekiel 30, same thing, Egypt, a day of the Lord. Joel chapter 2, we've got Judah again being judged, being destroyed by Babylon as a day of the Lord. In Amos chapter 5, we've got Israel/Samaria. He calls them both being judged, being destroyed, called a day of the Lord. So that's my thinking, that when he's saying you're going to see this day approaching based on the warnings that Jesus gave, you're already starting to see this. Remember, they received this letter in the mid-60s, and in 70, Jerusalem's destroyed. So as you see these signs that Jesus talked about, they're starting to come up, and you're going to see that Jerusalem is on track to getting wiped out. It's that much more important that we're considering one another, that we're stirring each other up, we're provoking one another to do good, to stay faithful, and not leave, but to keep getting together so we can encourage one another. And is that much more important as we see this judgment on Judah coming. Okay, anything else on this chapter or this paragraph that we looked at? I'm sorry that we went over. I was talking to Audrey this morning. I'm concerned I may not have enough stuff prepared. She said, oh, you'll be fine. I am fine. And then some. All right, if there's nothing else, let's pray and then we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we thank you that you give us this opportunity to come together to study your word. We ask that your truth would be taught, that it be in accordance with the word that you've given, that we're understanding it correctly, that it's being taught correctly, and that we're applying it to our lives to build ourselves up, to trust you more, to have confidence in the words that you've given us. We ask that we would live faithfully for you, that we truly would look for opportunities to consider one another and build each other up, so that no matter what we face in this life, we can be faithful for you. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen.